we begin, I'll admit calling this a slasher movie is technically disingenuous to the film's profoundly psychological execution, but in layman's terms, it's probably the most loosely streamlined way to sell the vague surface of its concept until we get into the sinister final details. Because the more I begin to describe it, the more I will ultimately spoil, so I cannot recommend it enough to experience this movie with as little information as possible. Dead Man's Shoes tells the story of a British soldier called Richard, who returns to his childhood home in Derbyshire, England, to seek vengeance on a local drug gang that abused and terrorised his younger brother Anthony while Richard was serving in the army. What initially begins as a process of harassing and intimidating the gang quickly turns violent as Richard takes on a brooding masked appearance, causing the gang to grow increasingly fearful for their lives as Richard's never-ending presence manifests into something truly monstrous.
I watched over you when you were asleep, and I looked at your fucking neck, and I was that far away from slicing it.
Dead Man's Shoes was very much a part of its time, and as such, it might not appear as the most original film amongst the sea of countless other revenge is never sweet style films, but there is a palpable kitchen sink realism to Dead Man's Shoes that very few other films can demonstrate. It's a story all about psychological warfare. Yes, it's visceral and violent as much as it is painfully heartbreaking, as we'll see later, but what truly defines it as one of my favourite films of all time is how aggressively authentic and confrontational its characters truly are. In British cinema, kitchen sink realism was the equivalent to what Italian neorealism and French New Wave were to their respective countries, as many of these independent films explored contemporary social issues, specifically around working class struggle, conflict, and disenfranchise. While Dead Man's Shoes is not thematically about social issues, its storytelling derives from a very naturalistic, almost partially amateuresque place, where character interactions and scene composition are incredibly raw, mundane, and deliberately spontaneous to heighten its fierce believability. In a way, you could almost mistakenly assume it's based on a true story, as it uses real locations, emphasizes dull, everyday circumstances, and presents the world in the most direct, honest, and unfiltered way possible. It became a personal trademark to director Shane Meadows, most prolifically in his later feature This Is England, and if you're familiar with some of Britain's niche independent cinema, it's a style also adopted by the film's lead actor and co-writer Paddy Considine when he made his brutal directorial debut Tyrannosaur a few years later. The point is, nothing in Dead Man's Shoes feels dramatic or over-stylized. It feels unpolished and improvised, like you're just observing real people reacting to the moment, rather than portraying obvious characterization. However, tonally, the film isn't just this dark, gritty, spit-in-your-face crime drama. It's built around a sensitive and nostalgic melancholy, where Richard and Anthony reflect on their childhood and the honest brotherly bond they seemingly share for each other that's become strained by both Richard leaving to join the army and Anthony's harrowing abuse. In a sort of twistedly subjective way, in Richard's mind, he tries to rationalize it as a quest out of both love and justice, but morally it does pose a challenging question that I will explore further in the spoiler section.
No, I'm the monster.
The thing about the main setting itself is that for all the grim locations, it's actually a really quaint, modest Christian village that technically lives without disturbance until Richard begins to terrorize it himself while seeking his vengeance. Don't get me wrong, he goes after bad people, but it comes at some sort of cost, which again we'll come back to in the spoiler section. Anyway, now that we've established the mood of the story and the general setup, let's get into some of the specifics about Richard, his attempts at retribution, and of course, the hideous gang itself. To put it simply, Paddy Considine is fucking relentless in this film. He's established as this disciplined, soft-spoken neighbour who you wouldn't give a weary look to, but that's at least until you witness moments where he is utterly explosive. In fact, he is literally psychotic.
The fuck are you looking at?
You cunt.
I understand in my initial synopsis I gave away that he ends up killing these people because it's the main point of the conflict, but at the start he kinda just messes with everyone in his path and you aren't entirely sure what he's going to do.
Sorry about that up there, mate. I really just lost the head there.
One thing we can acknowledge about his character is that he clearly experienced something in the military that left him with some form of post-trauma. Yet the film leaves this up to interpretation as to whether his actions are fueled by life-changing experiences or whether that inner violence was already there. However, the thing about the violence itself is that it's so downplayed and pointless that it lacks any catharsis for Richard, who emotionlessly brushes his victims aside as if they were nothing. As such, it begins to make you question what his desire for vengeance ultimately means. Yes, I know it's now an overused trope in storytelling, but for its time, it wasn't all that common to question the humanity of the central protagonist in the way that this revenge tale does. As the gang grow terrified of him, Richard even begins to exude something borderline supernatural. There's actually a scene later in the film where the gang attempt to assassinate him at a farmhouse and Richard just stands there cheerfully asking for it. And looking at it today, it's incredibly similar to that scene in Breaking Bad where Gus Fring confronts a sniper out in the open. I know it's a wild comparison and a very, very different story, but Richard is kinda similar to Gus Fring in a way. He's seemingly reasonable, calculated, highly manipulative, and has a sensitive mask to hide his vicious anger, but with a weapon, he's practically Michael Myers. Hell, during the confrontation, the gang even end up killing one of their own sent to lure Richard out, claiming it to be an accident, which it probably was, but it's that eerie ambiguity that further intensifies Richard's power over these men.
I wish I fucking was.
With that said, Dead Man's Shoes is still immensely subtle with its approach. Richard never does anything I would consider outlandish or theatrical, he's just the epitome of not giving a shit. There is nothing that scares him but himself. Richard's entire demeanour towards the gang is to torment and put the fear of God in them, thus exposing the cowardly, pathetic men that they are. Initially, they are presented as intimidating to the point you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of them, but these big, bravado, tough guy personas that they carry crumble into dust when confronted by a man who genuinely shows no fear towards them.
You're fucking there, mate. So get in that car and fuck off.
Their main leader Sonny stands out visually as someone with power and authority, but the first time he faces Richard, he's reduced to nothing. Richard calls their bluff essentially. He sees them as nothing more than shit on the bottom of his shoe, with the difference being that while these men might talk the talk, they sure as hell don't walk the walk that Richard does. With Sonny in particular, he's quite literally made out to be a clown with the film's dry sense of humour, revealing him as equally incompetent and wasteful as the rest of his men. Now, as you could probably tell by now, perhaps one of the most compelling aspects of the conflict is how it treats the perceived villains as victims. It's a unique subversion to see the objective bad guys shatter into vulnerable pieces. It doesn't make you care about them, but it does further humanize them as just normal people with complex emotions.
Fucking hell, I can taste it. I can taste it in my beer.
In many respects, to even say there are heroes and villains is simply untrue. With the film's focus on realism, all we see are humans no different from you or I, just floating through life absent of any explicit moral code. These men only know what they've been cultivated to accept. To the gang, it's drugs and power. To Richard, it's discipline and retaliation. Neither side is correct or more innocent than the other, and that's entirely the point. It's a meaningless, isolated conflict you'd read about in the news before going about your day. It has no impact on the world around them or determine any sort of outcome. Once it's over, and well, that's it. In Dead Man's Shoes, there is no reward for winning, as it were, and so entering into spoiler territory, this is where we dig into the true misery of the film. Brace yourself. So up to this point, I've withheld a significant soul-shattering revelation because it is likely to be fairly divisive. After finally killing the gang during an intense drug trip that mirrors Anthony's experience, Richard turns his attention to one final man called Mark, who was involved but non-participatory in Anthony's abuse. Before the events of the film, Mark had already left the gang to start a family and live a clean life, but he's revealed to have been forever burdened by the guilt, and so upon seeing Richard, he faces the most literal example of the past coming back to haunt him. However, the moment that truly brought me to tears the first time I saw it is when Mark tells his wife about what happened, revealing that Anthony actually hanged himself following a final violent humiliation from the gang. The agony of this twist is that it completely recontextualizes Richard's interactions with Anthony up to this point. Anthony was never there. Richard was living with false memories to feel some comfort for not being able to protect Anthony all those years ago, and his fearlessness partially comes from a place of being suicidal. Richard's vengeance is driven by anger not just towards the gang, but arguably more so towards himself, which Ian Meadows explained in an early interview.
God will forgive them. He'll forgive them and allow them into heaven. I can't live with that.
Essentially, it's reductive to say it's a cliched story where revenge is bad. Rather, it's a story about a personal, self-inflicted debt to be paid. There is a religious undertone to Richard's journey. He's basically on a violent pilgrimage of sorts, and upon confronting Mark, he actually begins to realize the vague notion of what real redemption actually is. Mark does not forgive himself for intervening in Anthony's abuse, but he has made an effort to better his life in a way that he knows, leaving Richard sickened by his own hatred and inability to forgive. The film ends with Richard forcing Mark to kill him so he can be at peace with his brother, leaving Mark with literal blood on his hands as choir music ominously plays over a bird's eye view of the town, again reinforcing just how pitiful and unfulfilling this tragic but forgotten ordeal ultimately is. It is easy to dismiss Dead Man's Shoes as tame when compared to violent realism in other films, but it's that restraint to not overindulge or even overthink its themes that make it a tangibly human film that I can easily say is one of my favourite films of all time. So until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.